The preface in Chapter 1, Part 1 of Through the Brazilian Wilderness. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by C.M. Slauson. Through the Brazilian Wilderness by Theodore Roosevelt. Preface and Chapter 1. The Start, Part 1. Preface. This is an account of zoogeographic reconnaissance through the Brazilian hinterland. The official and proper title of the expedition is that given it by the Brazilian government, Expedição Científica Roosevelt Rondon. When I started from the United States, it was to make an expedition, primarily concerned with mammalogy and ornithology, for the American Museum of Natural History of New York. This was undertaken under the auspices of Messrs. Osborne and Chapman, acting on behalf of the museum. In the body of this work I describe how the scope of the expedition was enlarged, and how it was given a geographic as well as a zoological character, in consequence of the kind proposal of the Brazilian Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, General Lauro Muller. In its altered and enlarged form the expedition was rendered possible only by the generous assistance of the Brazilian government. Throughout the body of the work will be found reference after reference to my colleagues and companions of the expedition, whose services to science I have endeavored to set forth, and for whom I shall always feel the most cordial friendship and regard. Theodore Roosevelt, Sagamore Hill, September 1st, 1914. Chapter 1. The Start. One day in 1908, when my presidential term was coming to a close, Father Zahm, a priest whom I knew, came in to call on me. Father Zahm and I had been cronies for some time, because we were both of us fond of Dante and of history and of science. I had always commended to theologians his book, Evolution and Dogma. He was an Ohio boy, and his early schooling had been obtained, in old-time American fashion, in a little log school, where, by the way, one of the other boys was Januarius Aloysius Magahan, afterward the famous war correspondent and friend of Skobeloff. Father Zahm told me that Magahan even at that time added an utter fearlessness to chivalric tenderness for the weak, and was the defender of any small boy who was oppressed by a larger one. Later, Father Zahm was at Notre Dame University in Indiana with Maurice Egan, whom, when I was president, I appointed minister to Denmark. On the occasion in question, Father Zahm had just returned from a trip across the Andes and down the Amazon, and came in to propose that after I left the presidency, he and I should go up the Paraguay into the interior of South America. At the time I wished to go to Africa, and so the subject was dropped. But from time to time afterward we talked it over. 5 years later, in the spring of 1913, I accepted invitations conveyed through the governments of Argentina and Brazil to address certain learned bodies in these countries. Then it occurred to me that, instead of making the conventional tourist trip purely by sea round South America, after I had finished my lectures I would come north through the middle of the continent into the valley of the Amazon, and I decided to write Father Zahm and tell him my intentions. Before doing so, however, I desired to see the authorities of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City to find out whether they cared to have me take a couple of naturalists with me into Brazil and make a collecting trip for the museum. Accordingly, I wrote to Frank Chapman, the curator of ornithology of the museum, and accepted his invitation to lunch at the museum one day early in June. At the lunch, in addition to various naturalists, to my astonishment, I also found Father Zahm, and as soon as I saw him I told him I was now intending to make the South American trip. It appeared that he had made up his mind that he would take it himself, and had actually come on to see Mr. Chapman to find out if the latter could recommend a naturalist to go with him, and he at once said he would accompany me. Chapman was pleased when he found out that we intended to go up the Paraguay and to cross into the valley of the Amazon, because much of the ground over which we were to pass had not been covered by collectors. He saw Henry Fairfield Osborn, the president of the museum, who wrote me that the museum would be pleased to send under me a couple of naturalists, whom with my approval Chapman would choose. The men whom Chapman recommended were Messrs. George K. Cherry and Leo E. Miller. I gladly accepted both. The former was to attend chiefly to the ornithology, and the latter to the mammalogy of the expedition, but each was to help out the other. No two better men for such a trip could have been found. Both were veterans of the tropical American forests. Miller was a young man, born in Indiana, and enthusiastic, with good literary as well as scientific training. He was at the time in the Guiana forests, and joined us at Barbados. Cherry was an older man, born in Iowa, but now a farmer in Vermont. He had a wife and 6 children. Mrs. Cherry had accompanied him during 2 or 3 years of their early married life in his collecting trips along the Orinoco. Their second child was born when they were in a camp a couple of 100 miles from any white man or woman. One night, a few weeks later, they were obliged to leave a camping place where they had intended to spend their night, because the baby was fretful, and its cries attracted a jaguar, which prowled nearer and nearer in the twilight until they thought it safest once more to put out into the open river and seek a new resting place. Cherry had spent about 22 years collecting in the American tropics. Like most of the field naturalists I have met, he was an unusually efficient and fearless man, and willy-nilly he had been forced at times to vary his career by taking part in insurrections. Twice he had been behind the bars in consequence, on one occasion spending 3 months in a prison of a certain South American state, expecting each day to be taken out and shot. In another state he had, as an interlude to his ornithological pursuits, followed the career of a gun-runner, acting as such off and on for 2½ years. The particular revolutionary chief whose fortunes he was following finally came into power, and Cherry immortalized his name by naming a new species and thrush after him, a delightful touch in its practical combination of those not normally kindred pursuits, ornithology and gun-running. In Anthony Fiala, a former Arctic explorer, we found an excellent man for assembling equipment and taking charge of its handling and shipping. In addition to his 4 years in the Arctic regions, Fiala had served in the New York Squadron in Puerto Rico during the Spanish War, and through his service in the squadron had been brought into contact with his little Tennessee wife. She came down with her 4 children to say good-bye to him when the steamer left. My secretary, Mr. Frank Harper, went with us. Jacob Sigg, who had served 3 years in the United States Army, and was both a hospital nurse and a cook, as well as having a natural taste for adventure, went as the personal attendant of Father Zam. In southern Brazil my son Kermit joined me. He had been bridge building, and a couple of months previously, while on top of a long steel span, something went wrong with the derrick, he and the steel span coming down together on the rocky bed beneath. He escaped with 2 broken ribs, 2 teeth knocked out, and a knee partially dislocated, but was practically all right when he started with us. In its composition, ours was a typical American expedition. Kermit and I were of the old Revolutionary stock, and in our veins ran about every strain of blood that there was on this side of the water during colonial times. Cherry's father was born in Ireland and his mother in Scotland. They came here when very young, and his father served throughout the Civil War in an Iowa cavalry regiment. His wife was of old Revolutionary stock. Father Zam's father was an Alsatian immigrant, and his mother was partly of Irish and partly of old American stock, a descendant of a niece of General Braddock. Miller's father came from Germany and his mother from France. Fiala's father and mother were born from Bohemia, being Czechs, and his father had served 4 years in the Civil War in the Union Army. His Tennessee wife was of old Revolutionary stock. Harper was born in England and Sigg in Switzerland. We were as varied in religious creed as in ethnic origin. Father Zam and Miller were Catholics, Kermit and Harper Episcopalians, Cherry a Presbyterian, Fiala a Baptist, Sigg a Lutheran, while I belonged to the Dutch Reformed Church. For arms, the naturalist took 16-bore shotguns, one of Cherry's having a rifle barrel underneath. The firearms for the rest of the party were supplied by Kermit and myself, including my Springfield rifle, Kermit's 2 Winchesters, a 4.5 and 30-40, the Fox 12-gauge shotgun, and another 16-gauge gun, and a couple of revolvers, a Colt and a Smith & Wesson. We took from New York a couple of canvas canoes, tents, mosquito bars, plenty of cheesecloth, including nets for the hats, and both light cots and hammocks. We took ropes and pulleys which proved invaluable on our canoe trip. Each equipped himself with the clothing he fancied. Mine consisted of khaki such as I wore in Africa, with a couple of United States Army flannel shirts and a couple of silk shirts, one pair of hobnailed shoes with leggings, and one pair of lace leather boots coming nearly to the knee. Both the naturalists told me that it was well to have either the boots or leggings as a protection against snake bites. And I also had gauntlets because of the mosquitoes and sand flies. We intended, where possible, to live on what we could get from time to time in the country, but we took some United States Army emergency rations, and also 90 cans, each containing a day's provisions for 5 men, made up by Fiala. The trip I propose to take can be understood only if there is a slight knowledge of South American topography. The great mountain chain of the Andes extends down the entire length of the western coast, so close to the Pacific Ocean that no rivers of any importance enter it. The rivers of South America drain into the Atlantic. Southernmost South America, including over half of the territory of the Argentine Republic, consists chiefly of a cool, open plains country. Northward of this country, and eastward of the Andes, lies the great bulk of the South American continent, which is included in the tropical and the subtropical regions. Most of this territory is Brazilian, aside from certain relatively small stretches drained by coast rivers. This immense region of tropical and subtropical America east of the Andes is drained by the 3 great river systems of the plate, the Amazon and the Orinoco. At their headwaters, the Amazon and the Orinoco systems are actually connected by a sluggish natural canal. The headwaters of the northern affluents of the Paraguay and the southern affluents of the Amazon are sundered by a stretch of high land, which toward the east broadens out into the central plateau of Brazil. Geologically, this is a very ancient region, having appeared above the waters before the dawning of the age of reptiles, or indeed of any true land vertebrates on the globe. This plateau is a region partly of healthy, rather dry and sandy open prairie, partly of forest. The great and low-lying basin of the Paraguay, which borders it on the south, is one of the largest, and the still greater basin of the Amazon, which borders it on the north, is the very largest of all the river basins on the earth. In these basins, but especially in the basin of the Amazon, and thence in most places northward to the Caribbean Sea, lie the most extensive stretches of tropical forest to be found anywhere. The forests of tropical West Africa, and of portions of the farther Indian region, are the only ones that can be compared with them. Much difficulty has been experienced in exploring these forests, because under the torrential rains and steaming heat the rank growth of vegetation becomes almost impenetrable, and the streams difficult of navigation, while white men suffer much from the terrible insect scourges and the deadly diseases which modern science has discovered to be due very largely to insect bites. The fauna and flora, however, are of a great interest. The American Museum was particularly anxious to obtain collections from the divide between the headwaters of the Paraguay and the Amazon, and from the northern affluents of the Amazon. Our purpose was to ascend the Paraguay as nearly as possible to the head of navigation, thence cross to the sources of one of the affluents of the Amazon, and if possible descend it in canoes built on the spot. The Paraguay is regularly navigated as high as boats can go. The starting point for our trip was to be Asuncion in the state of Paraguay. My exact plan of operations was necessarily a little indefinite, but on reaching Rio de Janeiro, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Lauro Muller, who had been kind enough to take great personal interest in my trip, informed me that he had arranged that on the headwaters of the Paraguay, at the town of Caceres, I would be met by a Brazilian army colonel, himself chiefly Indian by blood, Colonel Rondon. Colonel Rondon had been for a quarter of a century the foremost explorer of the Brazilian hinterland. He was at the time in Manaus, but his lieutenants were in Caceres, and had been informed that we were coming. More important still, Mr. Lauro Muller, who was not only an efficient public servant, but a man of wide cultivation, with a quality about him that reminded me of John Hay, offered to help me make my trip of much more consequence than I had originally intended. He has taken a keen interest in the exploration and development of the interior of Brazil, and he believed that my expedition could be used as a means towards spreading abroad a more general knowledge of the country. He told me that he would cooperate with me in every way if I cared to undertake the leadership of a serious expedition into the unexplored portion of western Mato Grosso, and to attempt the descent of a river which flowed nobody knew whither, but which the best informed men believed would prove to be a very big river, utterly unknown to geographers. I eagerly and gladly accepted, for I felt that with such help the trip could be made of much scientific value, and that a substantial addition could be made to the geographical knowledge of one of the least known parts of South America. Accordingly, it was arranged that Colonel Rondon and some assistants and scientists should meet me at or below Corumba, and that we should attempt the descent of the river, of which they had already come across the headwaters. I had to travel through Brazil, Uruguay, the Argentine, and Chile for 6 weeks to fulfill my speaking engagements. Fiala, Cherry, Miller, and Sig left me at Rio, continuing to Buenos Aires in the boat in which we had all come down from New York. From Buenos Aires they went up the Paraguay to Corumba, where they awaited me. The 2 naturalists went first to do all the collecting that was possible. Fiala and Sig traveled more leisurely with the heavy baggage. End of Chapter 1, Part 1.